Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Readsy. Today we're going to be talking about the unreliable narrator. Unreliable narrator is the technique of using a narrator or main character who lacks credibility in telling the story. Sometimes the technique can be used very subtly. Other times the entire book revolves around this fact. It can be the lead up to a big twist, or it can just be a pivotal element in the construction of the plot. To be fair, no first-person narrator can ever be truly reliable. All first-person narrators are unreliable because they're telling the story from their own place of bias. And of course, memory is faulty even for the most trustworthy of people. An unreliable narrator kind of takes this idea to the next level and makes the unreliable quality of the main character a pivotal element in the storytelling. The difference here is that with an unreliable narrator, their narrative impacts how the story is relayed and how we understand it. So what is the function of an unreliable narrator in a story? One of the main qualities of an unreliable narrator is that it makes the reader question their own interpretation of the story. An unreliable narrator introduces a gray area between what has really happened and what they're being told, and they have to read between the lines to interpret the story beyond what they're being told by the main character. When the reader can sense that there's something concealed underneath the surface of the narrative, this can create a lot of intrigue and a lot of tension. It can also create a very complex main character. Their reasons for being unreliable can add layers to a story. How a story is told is just as important as the story itself, and in this case, the mechanisms being used to tell the story are impacting the level to which the reader understands it. If the reader were being told the same story from an objective narrator, surely would also understand what happened. It would be without all the murkiness and all the texture that comes with an unreliable narrator. An unreliable narrator in this way is realistic, and they can be fascinating because of it. Not every single unreliable narrator is unreliable for the same reason or serving the same purpose within the story. So let's take a look at the three main types of unreliable narrator. Just like an unreliable narrator themselves, there's definitely gray area here. A character could pull qualities from multiple of these types, or be kind of an amalgamation of these types. These are kind of just three general types of unreliable narrator that you see. The first is the deliberately unreliable narrator. These are characters who know that they are being deceptive. They are purposely lying or withholding or twisting the narrative. They can often be unlikable, but if we understand their reasoning and their motive for lying, they can be fascinating characters. If their psychology is properly set up so we can understand why they're telling the story the way they're telling it, at least by the point we get to the end, they can be extremely memorable and extremely intriguing protagonists, even if we don't necessarily sympathize with them. It's important to note that this type of character is very difficult, if not impossible, to pull off in third person, at least with the level of ambiguity that this type of narrative aims to achieve. It can be a little difficult to explain, but when looking at the mechanics of point of view, third person doesn't really allow for a character who's consciously lying. In third person, the narrator doesn't know there's a story being told, even if the story is very psychically close, because they're not aware, they're not consciously telling a story. They can't really consciously lie either. So you can still have a character with the same kind of psychology, but it's probably not going to have the same level of ambiguity. So they can still have biases, but in third person, it's extremely difficult. You could even say maybe impossible for a character to purposefully lie to the reader because they don't know there's a reader. If you're interested in writing this type of narrative, a great classic example of a deliberately unreliable narrator is Alex from A Clockwork Orange. So if you want to see this technique in practice, that's a great example. Next up, we have the evasively unreliable narrator. These characters are unreliable and they have heavy biases, but they're kind of unconsciously altering the truth. Their motives can be muddy, anything from self-preservation to complete manipulation. Often these characters aren't aware that they're twisting the truth, but they're characters who have very twisted, complicated internal biases, very complicated psychology. They're kind of skewing the storytelling in a way that they find favorable for their narrative, even if they're not doing this on purpose. They might feel the need to justify their actions, so might water things down or embellish based on what's favorable to them. These characters can be fascinating to read about because their inner worlds are so complicated and their motivations can be so murky. A great example is Pi from Life of Pi by Jan Martel. By the end of the story, we're kind of left to figure out for ourselves whether Pi was telling the truth or fabulizing his own story in order to cope. He's not a reliable narrator, but he's not lying to the extent that a deceptive character would. This is basically an unreliable narrator who kind of falls in between a character who's purposefully lying and a character who just can't interpret events correctly. They're like the gray area of the gray area, so there's a lot to unpack. And finally, you might kind of guess where this is leading, but we have the naively unreliable character. This is a character who isn't intending to lie about the events, but for whatever reason, they are unable to correctly interpret the story. Because of their perspective or factors influencing their perspective, their understanding of the story isn't necessarily objective. And this makes the reader have to dig a little deeper to make sense of what the story is through their flawed perspective. There are a lot of reasons why we might see a naively unreliable character. In the example I'll talk about in a moment, it's due to the character's age. A lot of the time we see these characters who are maybe hallucinating or have memory loss. For this reason, their reality isn't objective, but they're still telling the story based on how they truthfully experienced it. This narrator type also brings in a great kind of side lesson when it comes to unreliable narrators. Don't cheat the reader by not giving them clues or reason. If a character is unreliable, but there's no way for the reader to interpret the truth, the device doesn't really accomplish anything. There should be clues for the reader to some extent, be able to figure out what actually happened. Remember, it's the discrepancy between truth and lie that make an unreliable narrator interesting. If we only get the lie, but there's no way for us to kind of see what was being concealed by the lie, this device doesn't really accomplish anything. Even if the reader can't get a 100% perfectly clear vision of what actually did happen, they should be able to see into that gray area and make some interpretations of what was being hidden from them all along. The story is sitting at the bottom of a pond. You'd have a reliable narrator if the water was just completely clear. If the water was so murky and grimy that we couldn't see the story at all, then there's nothing to really be taken away. A successful unreliable narrator happens when that water is murky enough to conceal the truth, but not so murky that the reader can't make sense of the story by looking a little more closely. A great example of a naively unreliable character would be Jack from Room by Emma Donoghue. Jack is only 5 years old, so his narrative is heavily limited by his age. He's not trying to withhold from the reader. His perspective is just so young that he can't interpret events the way they really are. So for a quick summary, an unreliable narrator is a character who lacks credibility in telling a story. This adds an interesting gray area between the story and how the story is being told. There are three main types of unreliable narrators: a deliberately unreliable narrator who is purposely being deceptive, an evasively unreliable narrator who's not consciously lying but is altering the truth unconsciously to favor themselves, and finally a naively unreliable character who's telling the story to the best of their ability. They simply aren't capable of perceiving or telling the story as it objectively and truthfully happened. That is how to write an unreliable narrator. Have you ever written an unreliable narrator? What was your experience with that? Or have you read any books that feature unreliable narrators? I really enjoy reading about the unreliable narrator. A lot of my favorite books feature this kind of character. One of my favorite novels, History of Wolves by Emily Fridland, features a very unreliable narrator, and that's part of what made the story so interesting. If you are looking to write about an unreliable narrator, I would definitely recommend that book. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.